Well, welcome everybody. I think I know everybody mostly here. My name is Samantha. I'm the assistant director here. Welcome to Book Sandwiched In. This is the start of our 44th program year, which is amazing. It's been around a little bit longer than I've been here, but so we're very happy to have you here. If you don't know, this is a book review program, so you don't have to have read the book before you come, which is one of the benefits. You can hear about it, maybe read it if it interests you. As you know, we've got coffee, tea, cookies, so please help yourself as we go along. I do want to mention that our program is sponsored by the Friends of the Library. If you're not a Friends member, I would very much encourage you to consider it. Friends memberships provide support and funding to programs like this. Our friends are very generous and they support so much of our programs, so I just wanted to give that little plug and thank them for that. So there are more of these up front, so if anybody is interested, please let me know. We also have program brochures for other programs here at the library over here on the table. So I think that's all my housekeeping. So our presenters today are Laura Dumuhosky, who is the Media Services Librarian here at Richmond Memorial Library, and Christina Mortellaro Frank, who is the Director for Trio Adult Educational Opportunity Center at GCC. So Laura has been here at Richmond for a year and a half, about. She's worked in libraries and living history for more than 20 years. She currently lives in the 200-year-old farmhouse her mother was raised in, with her husband, 2 children, and their cats. Christina Mortellaro Frank, as I said, works for the Trio Adult Educational Opportunity Center. She volunteers in many capacities, including as a board member for the Richmond Memorial Library Foundation and the Western New York, and as a Western New York representative for the Association for Equality and Excellence in Education. Christina is an avid fan of graphic novels and resides in Batavia with her husband Alex and 2 cats, Gizmo and Spooky. So without further ado, please take it away.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. So just to begin, to introduce the whole series, so this year's book Sandwiched In is focusing on graphic novels, and the majority of them are graphic memoirs. So most people grew up reading comics or cartoons like in the newspaper. Like if any of you had any favorite ones, like I know that like I always loved Peanuts, for example. And I think that when people think about comics as like an art form, they think about it as very juvenile and that it's only for children. And we wanted to start out the series with sort of the graphic novel that changed it all for the genre.
Yeah, really. Mouse really put the graphic novel genre on the map. It's the only graphic novel to date that has won a Pulitzer Prize. And Art Spiegelman is, he's had a very interesting history, which we'll talk about in a minute, but this is probably his biggest and most well-known work to date. We do have some copies that we can kind of pass around. It is technically 2 books, but you can get it as a single.
So we'll get started to tell you a little bit about Art's background and then obviously about the book itself.
So, for Itzhak Abraham Ben Ziv Spiegelman in Stockholm, Sweden, his father, Ziv Spiegelman, is a Holocaust survivor. But Art always wanted to be an artist. So he began his career doing trading cards in Topps Bubblegum. And you can see a little bit further down, he actually started the Garbage Pail Kids series, in 1985. But he wrote Mouse over 13 years. He was interviewing his father about his experience as a Holocaust survivor, and it took 13 years to really for him to process all of it himself and get it all on paper. Yeah.
Yeah, so the first like half or the first book was not a book originally. It came out as single chapter inserts, or like what you think about as like serialized comics within a comic anthology called Raw. And so he was publishing those different like smaller portions of what would be the first half of it in the anthology, and then it was so successful within the anthology because of like how powerful it was that he had sought out different publishers to get it into like a bound book, which was difficult to get, but eventually it was able to. And then once that book became a physical book and was being purchased within bookstores, it blew up in popularity, and then there was a time break between the first half and the second half. But he actually, he also he worked for the New Yorker in '92. He won the Pulitzer Prize specifically for like the second half of Mouse, so book 2, and that happened in '92. And then, I mean, the success of the first book was so powerful that it was translated into multiple languages, at least 10. Something like that. It's even mentioned in the second half of it. People wanted to make movie adaptations. He didn't want to do that. It just like blew up in popularity because of, I would say, the heart of it, because it's not just a Holocaust story. It's also a story about a father and a son.
Yes. It's, I would say, maybe even more so a story of a father and a son.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about how like he was able to popularize this genre and like lift it out of like what would be pop culture for like youth and really just elevate it to a form that like, yes, adults can read it, but there's also nothing wrong with like children reading comics either, but just as a way to expand the art form itself. Could you speak a little bit about that? Because I didn't add that.
Yeah, no, that's okay. So in interviews and things like that, Art Spiegelman talks about why did he choose the graphic novel form. And he talked about how complex these issues are and how complex memory is and things like that. And he just felt that having those illustrations and having it sort of block, little blocks of information, it mimics the way the brain processes these things.
Okay, move forward. So when you think of mouse, I mean, it's titled like mouse in German, and it stands for mouse. So my Western New York accent is not differentiating between the sounds, but essentially in the book, all the different groups of people are made into different animals. So the Jewish folks who are portrayed in the book, including himself, are all portrayed as mice. The Germans are portrayed as cats. The ethnic Poles are shown as pigs. I actually have different examples of it. So you have like the family, the father and his wife and their first son who passed, and then like the nanny who was a Polish woman. They also have Americans like that were all different types of dogs, and then also the French were frogs in it. And there's different reasoning behind it. So, I mean, you can think about like cat and mouse in terms of like the Holocaust of when it came to, like persecuting people and like how cats will like go after their prey. But it's also not just that. Also the way the language around Jewish identity at the time was also like very derogatory, like at large, the culture was, portraying them in a very derogatory way, in a way that, like mice, that they were diseased, that they were vermin, that they were taking over, areas of Europe. And so it is like also really intentional as like a way to not just show like how they were like persecuted, but as a way to show like the culture at large of what people were thinking at the time. I mean, with Germans being cats, yes, cats do like play with their prey and whatnot, but it's more than just that. And then there's some things like with the Poles. With Poland, it's a really complicated subject within the Holocaust, if any of you have ever studied it, because Poland was like the first country to get annexed, but also many of the individuals within Poland were the ones who committed the atrocities of the Holocaust itself. And so there's a very complicated identity within Poland when it comes to the Holocaust, because they simultaneously they claim like first victim, but then they also contributed to it. So, and with the Americans, because we're a melting pot and dogs tend to be, a melting pot of different, mutts essentially. So you'd have this one GI right there who is portrayed as this dog, but then you have all these different other types of dogs throughout the book too. The French, I think it's not just because of the eating frogs. I think there's also some type of joke around French being frogs, but I don't really know the cultural history of that. But these are just like selections from the book. And then we can move on because there's more groups of people.
Okay.
You can.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I found very interesting that he goes over in the book, in the second one where he talks about his wife.
Yeah.
Because his wife is French. But when they married, she converted to Judaism. And so he was sort of going over in his mind, do I make you a frog? Do I make you a mouse? Do I make you something else entirely? So he had her drawn as a rabbit for a little while. And she said, no, I converted, I want to be a mouse.
Yes. We'll also talk about the use of masks, but also there's some other groups that you see briefly towards the end of the book. Like you see Swedes and they're all like reindeer because there's a lot of reindeer in Sweden. And then also the Romani people, like you have this moth that like is dressed, like a gypsy Romani. And it sort of plays into some of the tropes and stereotypes, but also, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek at the same time. The last piece I wanted to mention about the masks is that they're used a lot in the book. So even though the father, he's often called Vladek, that like is his nickname. So Vladek often, when he's trying to go out in public, he tries to pretend to be Polish, not Jewish Polish, like ethnic Polish. And so the way that the author portrays it is that he's always wearing some type of like pig mask when he is doing that type of thing in public. So you see how, he was walking around, he was really nervous, he gets asked and he's like, may I talk to you for a moment? And he says, sure, soldier. And then he says, you're a Pole like me, so blah, blah, blah. And he literally tries to like play into like, some of the ethnocentrism of the time, I would say, in order to, survive with his family. But then also later on, this is only in the second book, the author himself, well, let me pull back for a second. So the way that the book is set up is that you have the present day of the book, where you have the author, Art, and his father, and then sometimes his wife, and sometimes his father's new wife, and they're in the present day. And then they flash back for the majority of the book into the World War II time period. But then you have a different, I guess, real present of the book, which is when the author is not just, he's a human man putting on the mask of a mouse to directly talk to the audience, to share about his experience while writing. So it's very meta, this part. But I think that this was probably the most powerful section for me when it got super meta. Yeah.
I would agree. I think when he's talking to his therapist.
Yeah. He's talking to his therapist, who's also his therapist is a survivor of the Holocaust, and then in that section, the therapist is also a human man wearing a mouse mask, and they sort of step out of time of the narrative to really address like what it means to be writing about survival, what it means to have this complicated relationship with someone that you dearly love who went through something that you can never experience.
Yeah, and the guilt that comes along with that and having to sort of carry around memories that aren't really yours.
Right. So, some of the symbolism. Okay.
So, we sort of felt like, you know, this is obviously very depressing, but we would have been remiss not to talk about work camps. Since we're talking about Holocaust survivors, we wanted to kind of reach back a little bit further to talk about how it didn't start at the Holocaust, right? Like, that's the big moment everybody remembers, but early on, they were not these concentration camps. They were work camps. And they were, the first was established inside a school. And they would, eventually they would start taking over all kinds of buildings. But supposedly, when the Nazis rose to power, they had no plans for something like a concentration camp. So they started out to detain people in what they called protective custody, which meant that you basically just had no rights. Like, even if you were acquitted, even if your sentence was up, they could still detain you. And a lot of those people, early days, were political prisoners. 80% were communists, and then 10% were social democrats, and the remaining 10% were union activists, and basically anybody who didn't want to join the Nazi Party. And they were all labeled by the newspapers as leftists and extremists. So, and then there was the Reichstag fire decree. I'm not sure I'm saying that right. Reichstag?
Reichstag.
Yeah. Which completely eliminated the right to personal freedom and officially provided a legal basis for detention without trial. So there was a sort of a slow build-up.
Yeah. So you began with political prisoners because they weren't in the party that was of power, and then that transitioned further into the next group of individuals. Good to move on. So then added more like habitual criminals of what they were called, and people that were considered to be asocial, and as well as Jewish individuals, besides just political opponents. So the asocial people were ones that they considered to be outside of the norm of what like respectable German society is supposed to be according to the Nazi Party. So that would include, you know, the Romani people. So when you think about, I was using Romani instead of Gypsy because like, people no longer use that as a term. But the Romani people, which has two different like ethnic subgroups within Europe. Also, anyone who was, you know, had experienced alcoholism, anyone who's a nomad, if you were a sex worker, so a prostitute, anyone within the LGBTQ group, even if it wasn't used that acronym, there was actually a very prolific sexology institute within Germany that was supporting individuals who were part of that community. And they created writings, they had like information about surgery, they were helping people transition. And then one of the largest book burnings actually was from that Sexology Institute. So they took the whole library and they burned it, and they added 20,000 other books to it. In addition, they also added beggars, so anyone who was poor, homeless, and people with disabilities. So they kept adding those individuals into these camps because they were considered to be not appropriate for being part of German society.
So they established about 70 camps within that first year in 1933, and they would, as I said, they started to just use basically whatever structure they could get their hands on, anything that was vacant, or in some cases wasn't vacant. The country estates one really gets me. I don't know why.
Yeah, I never knew about the country estates.
Yeah. But by mid-1935, these were waning, and so there were only about 5 camps holding about 4,000 prisoners, but then Himmler stepped in, and he believed that Germany was imperiled by, quote, organized elements of subhumanity, and he won Hitler's backing in 1936, and then the camps just exploded, right, figuratively. So earlier camps were closed, so no more country estates, no more schools, and purpose-built structures were put up, and they had to be isolated from the populations, because of course nobody, the real people of Germany, they didn't want to see that. And so by by the end of 1937, we have shot from just under 5,000 prisoners to just under 8,000 prisoners.
Which then leads to the actual Holocaust itself. So by the end of June of 1938, the prisoner population then rose up to 24,000 people. And I'll let you take some of this and I can go back and forth with you. Oh, it's okay. You're fine. So, so Himmler, he claimed that the prisoners that were in prison had committed these crimes of an offensive nature, whether they were sexual or if they were violent. So talking about all those groups that were asocial, he said all of them had either committed violent crimes or did these crimes against what is to be like proper society. When really most of them were just working class individuals who may have, like some of them who were in prison just may have done like petty theft. So an example, like when you think of Les Mis, you know, Jean Valjean, he steals a loaf of bread and he goes to prison. So when we're talking about petty theft, we're talking about that type of thing. Crimes of desperation that are not necessarily violent against individuals, but maybe just violent against businesses, as an example. If you're saying that you can be violent against a business. But they also targeted, you know, homeless and mentally ill individuals as well as unemployed. So the prisoners, once they were actually in the camps, had to do many strenuous tasks. So you had the farming that they had to do, not just, it wasn't really to feed the prisoners, it was really to feed the soldiers in the war. And then also constructing not just the camps themselves, but maybe constructing materials for the war. So it could be machinery for the war, it could be weapons for the war. But then we talked about how they can also add to like the camps themselves. So in the book, you see how Vladek, when he is actually in the camps, he becomes a tinsmith at one point. And so he is, you know, hammering the roof, and he is doing that. And he's also, well, he didn't do the quarrying, but he talks about how there's other people who are bricklaying. So they're actually building the camps that then exterminate the people themselves, which is really upsetting. The conditions, okay, you're okay.
So in addition to having to do all of these strenuous tasks, once the war officially broke out, basically all of the food and resources started to go to the soldiers. So now there's no food and strenuous labor. And so the number one killer of many of the people in these camps actually ends up being disease and malnutrition. Not to say that they weren't also just murdered outright, because they definitely were. And there were a million Jewish people cast upon arrival at Auschwitz. And at least 800,000 of the murdered prisoners were actually not Jewish, but some other kind of, you know, political prisoner or part of the LGBTQ community, something like that. And the total death toll is estimated between 1.8 million and around 2 million. So
For Auschwitz.
for Auschwitz, yes, thank you.
Yes, not for the whole
Not-
Holocaust
right,
itself.
that is much higher.
Yes. 6 million,
6
is
million,
what they
yeah.
say is like the actual like number is what they estimate.
This is just Auschwitz. This is basically like
Auschwitz one
One
and
incident.
then and
Like
two,
two, yeah.
and Auschwitz Birkenau.
Yeah.
But with the other like camps and whatnot, what's important to remember is that the Germans were really methodical with record keeping. So when people think about like 6 million is such a large number, how can that be? Because they also kept track of people. There's some that obviously they didn't keep track of, but in general, they kept really meticulous records, and that's how we're able to know so much. So that leads to the visual storytelling of the actual book. So most of the story takes place when we actually are in like the Holocaust. We're in the part of the war, starting in 38, I believe, like 37 or 38 is when the book begins, and for his father's story. And then it concludes post-war after that. But with the visual storytelling piece, I took a bunch of different samples of panels that I think were important to note. So I'm going to stand in front of this one to start. Whoops, I'm sorry. Okay, I won't. So this is his wife, Vladek's wife, Anna. She was experiencing mental health issues after her first son was born. So likely postpartum depression, but you know, they didn't have the language for that. So what they did was she went to a sanitarium to like rehabilitate and relax, and her husband went with her while the baby stayed with the nanny. And so as they're traveling across Czechoslovakia, they see for the first time the Nazi flag. So because it's not been everywhere. And what I think what's really important about this panel itself is that you're getting the content of, okay, they're traveling, they're having discussion, and then you see the impact of like, on the visual page, that half of it is devoted to people seeing this for the first time. Which sort of is, I think, going back to the whole human memory piece, when you see something that's like shocking or of awe for the first time, it sticks in your memory and it sort of stands out compared to the rest, right? So that's a way to take the memory and put it on the page, just as an example. And then this one, this shows like with the family, you know, he's talking with, you know, the nanny. They're trying to make decisions about, you know, what do we do? Who can we trust? The nanny's offended that they wouldn't trust her. She says, how can you say such a thing? I think he was part of my own family. But later on, it's not necessarily like that. It's just really tough. So the first book is sort of the lead up to their family breaking apart in a way. So there's a large extended family that's all together. And through, you know, losing businesses because the Germans had to take over businesses. The husband at one point was, he was actually in war, and he was a political prisoner at one point, and then he got out, and then he made it back to his family. But as time goes on, like the family keeps splitting apart until by the end of book one, it's just him and his wife. So let me move on to the next panel. This one is the same page. I just wanted to really expand, like show it closer. I think what's really helpful also about the visual storytelling is that sometimes when you're reading information, like not everyone has the same like idea of what something looks like, as an example. But also you can really see the impact when you physically see it in front of you. So in order to try to get, this is when Vladek is in Auschwitz, the first, like Auschwitz 1, and then his wife's in Auschwitz 2, Birkenau. And he wants to get his wife into Auschwitz 1 because they're trying to have a women's portion of the camp open. So he needs to bribe someone. And so he's explained to his son, this is him in the present day. His son is smoking the cigarette, talking to Vladek is an older man. And he's, you know, saying, how can that be? Like, you could actually get cigarettes? And he said, yes, we actually got 3 cigarettes a day for, you know, as like our allotment for, you know, our labor and whatnot. And how, in order to arrange to get his wife to come, he needed to get 100 cigarettes and a bottle of vodka. So if one day's bread could be traded for 3 cigarettes, and 200 cigarettes would equal a bottle of vodka, you can do the math. like how much would need to be saved up. And then he tries to save up and then someone steals it. But you can see in this section, like we're back in the present day again, so it goes back and forth. So we've got the father narrating the past, present day, father narrating the past, present day, father narrating the past. And something I wanted to note about the language itself, what's really helpful is that Art recorded his father with these interviews. So the way that his speaking, his cadence, the syntax, it is all the father. So sometimes you might read something and you're like, that phrase a little weird.
All what I got organized.
Yes, all what I got organized. And with them was on this I arranged. And you can even see he like sort of italicizes the this. To show like, you know, this I arranged, which is, you know, the cadence of, you know, someone who speaks Yiddish and Polish and then also speaking English. You can see how like there's a true reality to the way the language is. Do you want to add anything about the panels? Okay. Thanks. Okay. And then in this section right here, this is where I'm talking about why it's helpful to have like the visual element of it. So we'll start on this side. So we're in the present day and then the rest of the past. So he's explaining how before the family was separated, what they tried to do was hide the elderly in their family. Because at one point the Germans were saying anyone above the age of 70 had to go to this, they didn't call it a camp. They essentially, it was a camp though. They were bringing them to one of the death camps, but they didn't call it that. They had said that everyone, it was they're going to a convalescent home because the elderly couldn't, you know, stay with them. They would be well taken care of, things like that. And their family's like, no, we're not going to do that. We've been a family for 70 years. We're not going to break apart. So what they did was they actually put two of the elders, the grandparents, behind a false wall in the storage shed, and they kept them hidden for the longest time. And then he shared how, you know, we stuck food to them when it was safe. Then we took them inside for a little bit. Eventually, the family is found, which is really upsetting, but without the visual element of the comic itself, you don't get to see that. Like if someone is describing that there was a storage shed and there was a false wall, you can sort of picture it in your mind, right? And you can be really descriptive in the language. But when you physically see it, I feel like it impacts you in a different way because you're sort of thinking about like the people that you know and what it would be like to sit there in a shed yourself. And another way, so at one point, this is a completely different panel in a different section. Besides being a tinsmith within the camps, Vladek was also a cobbler at one point. He just sort of got his way into different jobs, and that's how he survived, was, you know, talking to different people saying, I have this skill, I have this skill. And he explained like how he repaired this one boot. So you can see physically like, okay, as he's describing it to his son, what it means, and then his son drew it out. So you can get a better idea of like, you know, how did he cobble a boot while he was in the camps? So, oh yeah, he says, you're better than our last shoemaker. So, and then Vladek says, you see, good to know how to do everything. So, and that's like his lesson to his son, is like, it's important to know how to do everything, because you never know when you need it. Before you move on, I think this is when there is a little bit of a more disturbing panel, so I just wanted to warn you that. I believe it was this. Yeah, it is. I'm going to stand on this side first. So, also at one point, Vladek, towards the end of the war, he becomes a tinsmith again. And this is when the Germans are losing, the Russians are about to infiltrate, and the Germans said, we got to hide everything that we did. So they're trying to have them take apart the actual gas chambers. And so he describes when he's a tin man what he did, and how he was taking apart the gas chambers and what it looked like, how in the undressing room, like the locker room, it literally looked like a pool locker room, and it shows you how there was like, you know, things for their clothes and all of that. And he said that, you know, he never anticipated seeing that, or, oh yeah, if I saw a couple months before how it was all arranged here, only one time I could see it. Basically saying, if I saw this before this point, I would have died, you know, I only would have seen it once. But I got to see it more than once because I was taking it apart at the time period. And this is the part that I thought was really impactful, where I told you he takes off the mask and he's addressing the audience directly. And he's sharing how, you know, what happened between the first book and the second book, and how it was a critical success. And this is the part that was like disturbing down here, where you have like the bodies of the people who had passed. But it also made me think about when I learned about the Holocaust in school, and I distinctly remember seeing like the piles of shoes and things like that. And it sort of reminded me of that, where it's discarded. And I think you can see that there's like pain. Even though he's wearing a mask, you know, his body language is really slumped. You can see there's depression. You've got flies like swarming around, so, which implies that there's some type of, you know, funk in the air, right? Which you could be like out of the physical bodies, but it's not just the bodies, it's the metaphorical like pain. And the fact is, like, it's really difficult to be like your best work is also about something that's incredibly painful, and you're taking on this legacy of people that like you never knew. And he says, literally, lately I've been feeling depressed. So for criticism of Mouse, it was picked up in a lot of different school curriculum. I never read it in school. Did you read it in school?
I read it in college.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't read it in college either. But in January 2020, a Tennessee school district, they were using it for their English language arts curriculum during the Holocaust unit. And there was complaints from people on the board and some parents about how there was nudity, which you saw there was like nudity, but it's not sexual in nature, obviously. It's done to show like the horrors of war. And that there's also inappropriate language. So they were debating that they should actually like white out the curse words. And then they said, well, we wouldn't be able to have the copyright, or we wouldn't be able to utilize the books. So the curse words, there aren't that many.
No. It's pardon my French, it's goddamn.
Yeah.
Those were the words they were opposed to.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Right.
Shocking.
Exactly.
You should hear what the kids say.
Right?
Exactly.
I know.
So that was like the main two complaints from that. There was also a complaint about like the violence, but that wasn't really the majority of the complaint. But the board voted to remove Mouse from the curriculum. And then, if you want to take on the other two.
So literary critics sometimes will, I don't know, deter from the story. I guess they're sort of, his detractors will say that he's stereotyping and that he's oversimplifying the Holocaust. It's a hard argument to make, because unless you wrote, 12 books long, of course you're oversimplifying the Holocaust. And the stereotyping, as Christina talked about, is done on purpose for very specific reasons. Sometimes I think in literature people just have to have something negative to say.
Right.
I can say that without malice. I was a literature major.
No, me too. So like, I was creative writing, but you always got to critique things. And I think that he tries to address it. I didn't get to read this yet, but there was a book in 2011 he wrote called Meta Mouse, and it's about the creation of Mouse and sort of addressing some of the things that we talked about. So I'm really excited to read it, but I need to find a copy first of all.
I also think that his oversimplification of the Holocaust, and maybe in part the stereotyping, comes from the fact that for him it really, I think, was meant to be more a book about his relationship with his father, right? It's, you know, yes, the subject matter is the Holocaust, but that was incidental. This was about spending time with his father, asking him questions, hearing his stories, and trying to help him sort of process the grief and guilt that he felt. And I think that in a way that your mention of his detailed use of his father's language, his cadence and everything, I think that is an example to me of, you know, the sort of deference that he's showing to his father.
Right. It's not like he's completely, like, he shows his frustrations with his father too, like in the present day. Like his father does a lot of things that he doesn't understand, like he understands, but he also doesn't like understand. Like, as an example, his father was trying to return food, like cereal boxes that were already open, because he couldn't eat the food because it wasn't any good. It couldn't work for his diet. And so he's like, you need to bring me to the grocery store and I will return the food. And the son, Art, says, I'm not going in there. You got to do this. I'm not doing it. But he also is like frustrated because he knows you can't return open food. But don't you know Vladek does return the open food? And he's like, and I got $6 worth of food for $1. So, and he wrote other things too. It's not just Mouse. We talked about how he, wrote for the New Yorker. He had some other books too. But there's a documentary that just came out this past year, and actually this April, so in a few weeks, it's going to be on PBS American Masters, and you can watch about his life and how he was able to use not just this, but what his career has been like. So that's coming out, PBS American Masters, April 15th at 10 p.m. I'm sure you could find it elsewhere.
Okay, so should you read this book? I think the most important thing to lead with is that it is very emotionally taxing to read this book. But it's beautiful, and it really is this like beautiful, inspiring story of his relationship with his father and everything that comes along with a relationship with your parents, right? Including the frustrations and the humor, and I loved it. This was actually the graphic novel that made me think, oh wait, maybe they are literature. And I think, his art style has also been criticized. It's very simple and straightforward, but again, I believe that to be on purpose. And I think that the stark visuals, sort of, and the black and white too, it sort of lends itself. And then this is just a nice quote that I found from her.
Yeah, I always recommend reading this. This is not the first graphic novel I read. The first one that really hit me was called Persepolis. We didn't pick it for this group because there's so many good ones to select from. But that's about a girl in Iran during the Iranian Revolution of the 70s. So you get to see before and then after, and then she goes to Europe. And I studied a lot of creative nonfiction, and so I was used to seeing written word. I was used to seeing photojournalism, maybe some documentary. I never really thought of cartoon animation as a mode for telling someone's story. And then I could see how this could impact you in different ways, because it's not just analyzing the language, but you also can analyze the art style and see how the page is composed. I think, like Laura said, it's beautiful. It's really hard to read at times, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't, because sometimes, well, not sometimes, I think it's really important to know these stories and the earnest attempt to not repeat them.
We're already repeating it.
Is there anything else you wanted to add about?
I think everybody should read it.
Everyone should read it.
I do want to add, though, that Art Spiegelman, the author, also wrote the introduction for one of our other graphic novels that we will be discussing.
Dr. Seuss Goes to War, April 23rd.
Come back for that.
Shameless self-promotion.
That's right.
And then, does anyone else have any questions? Because I think our last slide's just a thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I have a question. Because while you're doing that, I'm thinking, this book has been banned, and I think it's been banned in a lot more places than just the Tennessee
Yeah.
thing that you mentioned, which is really sad because of all the Holocaust deniers that are out there now. And it's only getting worse, along with all this other stuff about what people are okay to put away, you know. So I think that this book and others like it should be promoted now, so people begin to think about what happens when you call people vermin and what happens when you denigrate a whole group of people.
Right, I think that's probably why a lot of them try to use it in like curriculum for like for a school in particular, especially when you think about middle school. Ooh, what a tough age. And if you ever are around any middle school students, like anytime, that tends to be the group where they're really pushing boundaries and they're repeating things that they may have heard, and they're repeating things that they think are funny because they don't have the lived history behind them because they're 13, 14, and it's hard because what do you know? Like, what do I know about the Holocaust?
Right.
I didn't live through it.
Right.
There's only so much.
Yeah, and that's part of Art Spiegelman's point, right? It's like, what do I know about it?
Right.
Just what I'm told by my dad, and
Yeah.
I'll never really understand.
So it's like a way that they're, you know, to try to build that bridge so people can understand it, to not forget it. And it's tough because when any type of art that there is, whenever there's art in terms of language or the content that they're talking about, it's always reflecting whatever culture, you know, is at hand. And it's always hard to critique culture because there's a bunch of people who just, you know, always love what's happening. And I'm not saying that about any particular time period. This is just perpetual. There's always people who are going to be like, yes, I'm happy with what's happening as the status quo. How dare you criticize it? Why are you putting this in a book? Why are you putting this in a movie? And, you know, in my opinion, as an individual, art's always trying to, you know, just show a different perspective to make sure that, like, people don't forget.
I think what was notable too about the Tennessee ban was that it was just a few days before Holocaust Remembrance Day that they passed that ban, and it kind of made national news. And then Mouse ended up on New York Times bestseller lists again.
Right.
Our copies had hold lists, which is a great response to, you know, people trying to prevent other people from reading it. So that definitely was interesting in our field to see of, you know, how people do respond when someone tells them, no, you shouldn't read this. You know, people shouldn't be exposed to this. Oh, what is it that I shouldn't be exposed to? What, you know? So that was kind of an interesting thing that happened, and I think for whatever reason that particular ban kind of gave this book a revitalization in public knowledge, I guess.
When it's over, can you go back to a certain slide? Like,
Yeah.
I think it's going on.
We can go back to a certain slide.
The one before the progression.
Are we, okay, so,
Yeah.
oh, the word camps, okay.
Any other questions for our presenters?
If this is not the right slide, we can always go to the right slide.
Yeah.
I think that's
We do have a copy of the book over here that's available to check out if anybody's interested, and this is the complete Mouse. So it's parts 1 and 2, if anyone's interested in that.
And the copy that's circulating is currently checked out to me, but I'm gonna go straight back and check it back in if anybody wants to borrow that.
This is GCC's copy, so you can't take it, unfortunately. I do have to bring it back.
You
but-
could go to GCC and check it out if you
Yeah.
really wanted
You
to.
could, exactly.
So thank you for coming. I just wanted to do a brief overview of the rest of our series so you know what's coming up. Next week, we have Megan Boring is going to review Kid Gloves, 9 Months of Careful Chaos by Lucy Nisley. That's another graphic novel memoir. April 16th, Ted Hawley will be reviewing the comic book Story of Beer. We tried to pick graphic novels that would really show the breadth of topics covered in this genre. April 23rd, Richard will be reviewing Dr. Seuss Goes to War, the World War II editorial cartoons of Theodore Seuss Geisel. And then on April 30th is our only fiction selection for this series, which is Watchmen by Alan Moore, which is kind of the touchstone graphic novel in the fiction genre. And that will be presented by Rob Dumo, who is also a artist, illustrator, and writes comics, or illustrates comics, I should say. So he's going to share both about the graphic novel itself and his perspective as a creator of those kinds of things. So that's what's coming up. Thank you for coming today. I'll pick the door prize because that's very important. Yes?
Just ask a kind of a tangential type of question. What do you see in terms of the circulation of graphic novels as compared to standard book form? Who's taking the?
So, like any other genre, we have graphic novels for adults, teens, and children. So, no, Mouse is not going to be great for a 6-year-old that's starting to read, right? It's not appropriate. But there are a lot of, and actually there's a lot of studies that show that kids can learn to read better through the graphic novel format because it's visually stimulating as well. So there are, genres or age brackets for each graphic novel. They are extremely popular. They are extremely popular. Some of our highest circulating items. I would say adults are a little bit less, but for the series for adults, I would say they circulate just as much. The fiction probably circulates more than the nonfiction, but that's kind of standard anyway. So, yeah, they're very popular.
Just a quick aside, well, connected to that, so the Babysitters Club, like that book series from the 90s, they created a graphic novel version of it, so the writer of it, she also was like part of it, so children can still take out like the regular chapter book version of it, but they can also take out the graphic novel version, which is great because then you can also see how's like a story told with some pictures and how